reCAPTCHA is a service that helps protect websites from spam and abuse. A CAPTCHA is a kind of test to differentiate humans from bots. It is easy for humans to solve but hard for bots and other malicious software to figure out. By adding reCAPTCHA to a site, you can block automated software and bots activities. In this tutorial, I will be showing you how to add Google reCAPTCHA to an AdonisJS application. And we will be making use of version 3 of Google reCAPTCHA, which verifies requests with a score instead of a challenge as with version 2. That way, users doesn't have to complete any challenges, but instead, reCAPTCHA works behind the scene, and based on a certain score, Google reCAPTCHA is able to determine whether requests are valid or not. To get started, we need to head over to the Google reCAPTCHA website and register a new site. I currently have one for Adonis Mastery, so we're going to register a new one which we will use for the purpose of this tutorial. For the label, typically this will be the domain name. So this will be 127.0.0.1. Then, like I said earlier, we'll be making use of version 3 of the Google reCAPTCHA. Then for the domain name, I'll enter 127.0.0.1. Then we need to accept the terms and conditions. And if you like, you can leave this checked. I'm going to uncheck it, then submit. The site has been registered and we have been presented with the necessary keys, which we'll make use of in our code later on. Instead of hard-coding these keys directly in our code, we are going to create a dedicated config file, which will allow us to be able to reuse the keys across the application. So I'm going to create a new file inside the config directory, which we will call reCAPTCHA.cs. And inside the file, we'll create an object, const reCAPTCHA. That will contain the site key, which we'll get from an environment variable. So first, let's pull in env. Then we can do env.get. Then the environment variable, which we will call reCAPTCHA underscore site underscore key. Then we'll do the same for the secret key. Finally, let's export the object. It will be the default export. Next, let's define the environment variables. The value will be this, which you can copy. Then the secret will be this. We can take this further by validating the environment variables inside the env.ts file. The keys will be basically required strings. So env.schema.string. Then we'll do the same thing for the secret. Next, we need to add the Google reCAPTCHA script to our page. Since our application uses a master layout, so we are going to add the script directly inside the layout file, which is inside app.edge. So we are going to add the script here. We will load the script with our site key. For that, we need to add the render parameter to this script. Render equals our site key. So instead of hard coding the key here, I'll pull it directly from the config file. Config reCAPTCHA.site key. I'm able to use config here because I already created a config global, which you can see inside. Next, we need to execute Google reCAPTCHA on the action or page we want to protect. We will be implementing this on the login page. So let's head over to the login page. Then first we give the form an ID of just form. Also, we add an hidden input field that will contain the Google reCAPTCHA token that will be generated for us. We'll get to that later, but now let's just add the input field. We will give it a name of reCAPTCHA token. Now, we can start adding the JavaScript implementation. The way we want this to work is that before the form is submitted, we want to execute the Google reCAPTCHA, which will generate a token that we can verify later on after submitting the form. We will be adding the JavaScript code directly inside this view. And we are able to do this because I have added a script section inside the master layout. As you can see. So we have the section here, which I call scripts. Then inside here, we will have the script. We'll start by selecting the form, document.querySelector. Then we'll target the form with the ID of form. Then we'll add an event listener, which will be on submit of the form. Then the handler will be an arrow function, which will take in the event. The first thing we do is prevent the default behavior of forms, which will automatically submit the form once the submit button is clicked. So event.prevent default. With this, we'll be able to submit the form manually later on. So now we need to execute the Google reCAPTCHA and generate the necessary token. But first, we need to make sure that Google reCAPTCHA is ready and loaded on our page for us to use. We can do that by calling the ready method, Google reCAPTCHA.ready. This will take in an arrow function. Inside this function, we are sure that Google reCAPTCHA is loaded on the page. So we can call on the execute method, Google reCAPTCHA.execute. The execute method accepts two arguments. The first one is the Google reCAPTCHA site key. Then the second one is an object. So let's start with the site key, again, which you can get from the config just as we saw earlier. Config, then reCAPTCHA.site key. Then for the second argument, which will be an object that will contain an action. Action here can be the task we are trying to do. For example, since we are trying to log in, we can call the action login. Actually, this can be anything, but it is preferable to give an action a more descriptive name, because the action can serve as a label that can be used to distinguish each request. This returns a promise which we need to handle. Then, again, we'll make use of an arrow function. Here we'll get the token that was generated. And for now, we'll simply log it to the console. Let's try this out in the browser. The Google reCAPTCHA script has been loaded. As you can see, we now have this here, which indicates that this page uses Google reCAPTCHA. I'm going to open Dev2. Let's try logging in. Just as we expect, the token has been logged. What we need to do next is take this token and verify it on the server side. Before we can do that, we need to make the token available on the server side, which was why we added the hidden input field, if you recall from above. So all we need to do now is set the value of this input field as the token. Let's get rid of this. First, let's get that input field. Document.querySelector input. And the name is reCAPTCHA token. Then we simply set its value to the token. Before we submit the form, let's try this out again. I'm going to refresh this, then open the inspector and target the hidden input field. Let's watch the input field and see what happens to it when we submit the form. As you can see, the value has been set to the token, which is exactly what we need. Now we can proceed to submit the form. To do that, I'm going to save the form in a variable. So I'm going to cut this and create a new variable, which I will call form. Then I will assign it to the form that was selected. Then I can do form.addEventListener. Now we can submit the form using form.submit. Now let's undo the form submission on the server side. So I'm going to open the auth controller, which contains the logic for submitting the form. Then inside the login method, the first thing we do is retrieve the reCAPTCHA token. Now we can make use of it. To verify the token, we need to make a request to the Google reCAPTCHA API. Of course, to make the request, we need to use some kind of HTTP client. For the sake of this tutorial, I'll be making use of Axios. Of course, you can use whatever you are comfortable with. I'm going to install Axios, npm install Axios. Once installed, we are going to pull it in. While we are here, let's also pull in config because I know I'll be needing it. Now we can make use of Axios. Await Axios.post. Then the endpoints we are posting to will be https google.com/reCAPTCHA/site verify. These endpoints accept the reCAPTCHA secret key, which we will get from config. Then reCAPTCHA.secret key. Then a response, which will be the token. This won't work quite right because by default, Axios will serialize the JavaScript object to JSON, and this endpoint expect the data to be in a URL encoded format. So we need a way to do that with Axios. One way we can achieve that with Axios is to simply stringify the data. And for that, we'll be making use of the built-in Node.js query string module. Import stringify from query string. Now we can make use of it by wrapping all this inside the stringify method. Let's get the response from this request. So const, I'm going to extract the data object. Then for now, let's simply return the data. Let's try this out in the browser. Oops, request failed with status code 404. And AdonisJS is throwing a 500 error. I'm pretty sure I have screwed up something. Let's see. So this should be /API then /site verify. Let's give it a retry. So this is the response that we got from the verification API, which contains some couple of information. First, we have a success key, which is set to true. The challenge timestamp, which is simply the time the action was carried out. Then the host name, since we are on localhost, this is why it is set to this. Then we have the score and the action, which are the ones we'll be paying much attention to. Let me quickly mention this. Though the status here says true, we shouldn't judge based on the success key, because this simply means that fine, we sent the request to the Google reCAPTCHA API, then we got back a successful response. That is what this simply means. To actually check if a user is an actual user or a bot, we should make use of these other two properties, that is the score and the action. And because we set the action to login, that is why the action here is set to login. This score is what Google reCAPTCHA uses to determine if an action is performed by an actual user or an actual human or a bot or some spam. The score can be anything between 0 and 1. While 1 simply means that the action is very likely to be from an human, then 0 simply means that the action is very likely to be from a bot. So based on the score, we can undo that accordingly on our application. Personally, I tend to regard a score that is below 0.7 as a bot, then anything above 0.7 as an actual human. Again, this is just my own personal take. You can use a value that is more appealing to you or your application. With that said, we are going to do an if check here. If first, we're going to check the status of the response, data.success, which is a boolean as we saw earlier. So we are going to say if not success, that is if the request is not successful, or if the score is less than 0.7, and lastly, or if the action is not equals to login. They will know that the request is a fraudulent one. I'm going to simply flash a message to the session. And the message will be reCAPTCHA verification failed. Then we'll simply return back. But if the request is successful and we get a score that is above 0.7 and the action is set to, this should be not equals to. Then if the action is set to login, then we are sure that the request is an authentic one made by an actual user. Then we can now proceed to doing our normal login flow. Just for testing, let's set the score to be less than 1.0. As you can see, we got the appropriate message. Let me revert this. So this is how to add Google reCAPTCHA to an AdonisJS application.